So again, my name is Julie Fong. I would like to welcome you back to day 2 of Reorient, Reset, and Rise. We're so glad you're here with us today. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Region 9 and Region 10 teams. We encourage you, as long as you're comfortable, to come on to camera. We want to see your happy, smiling faces, or just your faces in general, even if they're not happy and smiling. I want to give you a couple of prompts just to remember that we'd love for you to engage in the chat. So submit questions, comments, or feel free to raise your hand. If you'd like to come off mic to ask a question, that would be great. If you're not asking a question or making a comment, though, we ask that you keep your mic on mute. That would be really helpful. Next slide, please. So on the screen, you'll see an agenda for today. We are going to do a state Tanf Essentials. We will then have a fireside conversation with Peter Germanis and Julie Siegel, who are the Office of Family Assistance, the respective state policy director, and the national Tanf expert. So we're really happy to have them here with us. And then we're going to do a wrap up and debrief. Today, we do have a 10-minute bio break, and so that will happen between the fireside chat and the presentation. This presentation is going to be long, and this is not the most exciting material, but we're going to really try to make it exciting and engaging, and as exciting and engaging as we can. Really hope that we can engage with all of you around your questions. So I'll lay that out as we proceed into the presentation. All right, next slide, please. So the meeting agenda, speaker bios, and PowerPoints are available on the Visibo website. If you have trouble accessing that, let us know so that our technical folks can help you with that. Again, please remain on mute unless you're asking a question or making a comment. If necessary, please ensure that you're named in your little box so that we know who you are for discussion purposes. Captions are available by clicking the More button and then Show Subtitle. So there's a little closed caption box on the list kind of under at the bottom of the screen next to Reactions, between Reactions and Record. You can submit questions for all of the presenters via the chat box at any time. Some of the questions, we're going to really try to answer all of the questions we can. Some of the questions we may need to parking lot, but we will definitely circle back around to you to get to those. We want to encourage you to please complete the evaluation survey poll at the end of the day that will pop up like it did yesterday. And if you need technical assistance, please send a message in the chat box and tech support will assist. We've got Zoom tech support with us today, and they are very happy to assist. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to do this state Tanf Essentials. I want to give you some framework for it before we dive in. This presentation was really intended to highlight key essentials. If we did a deep dive on this, this session would be at least a semester-long course, unless Peter Germanis presented it, and then it would be a 2-year course. I have to make a joke since he's on. The overall PowerPoint is almost 60 slides long, and so what we did is we pulled the most essential slides to make this session manageable for all of you and to keep you all awake and engaged. So we have abbreviated it, but it's a very long presentation. We will not be sharing the PowerPoint with you at this time. We're going to share it with you all at a future date. We have to make sure that everything is technically accurate. And not that it's not, but we just want to make abundantly sure that everything is as technically accurate as possible. And so we're going to have a final set of policy and general counsel eyes on it before we distribute it. If there's anything in particular that you want to ensure that you capture, we really recommend that you take notes, okay, since we will not be giving you a copy of this PowerPoint right now. Please also take note of the topics for which you'd like to follow up in the future or have more in-depth technical assistance from your region. because we're happy to do a deeper dive with you all. We just need you to identify those areas you want to do the deeper dive in. We really hope that this training serves as a foundation. You're all doing really innovative work and administering very innovative programs. So we're hoping this will serve as a foundation that roots you in the essentials, so you can devote the majority of your bandwidth to innovation. So we hope that this serves as an open door to future deeper dives on essential TANF understanding. It's a complicated program. There's still a lot to learn about it. The majority of us who've been doing this work for years are still learning today. And we need to revisit the guidance, the regs, everything over and over again, because it's complicated. We won't have time to go into all of the guidance associated with each element that we cover here. But we, again, invite you to submit your questions. And if we can't answer today, we will follow up. We also encourage you to explore the OFA website. There's a lot of information on that. And you can also always reach out to your program specialist. The guidance presented here, you'll notice a lot of hyperlinks, which of course you won't be able to access because we're not giving you a copy of the PowerPoint right now. But we could potentially put a list together of the hyperlinks if that would be helpful. So please drop a note in the chat or let us know in some way. The other thing is that all of these hyperlinks are available or accessible via the website. Since each jurisdiction has the authority to build the programs that comply with these rules, but also respond to the needs of your unique community, not all programs are the same. So in revisiting these core essentials, we're hoping that you'll be prompted to think about new program opportunities, pivots, innovations, things of that nature. We also hope that this will prompt you to think more about future essentials elements that you'd like to explore more deeply, as I said before. Okay. We appreciate any feedback you have on this presentation, anything you'd be interested in. If there are pieces of the materials that you're particularly interested in, we'd like to hear about that. And we'd appreciate any feedback you have around where we might make the materials more clear that you see today, okay? So if you think that the piece of what we present today is unclear or needs some added clarification, please let us know. I'd like to really give a big thanks to the many OFA program staff who worked to develop this really comprehensive training and presentation. It was a heavy lift, and I am deeply appreciative of your work, and I think that our partners will also be really appreciative, so thank you for that. And we're hoping that you all can build on this while we're going through it and as we move forward. So please bear with us. If you need to take a break before we give you the break, please feel free to do so and take care of yourselves. Hopefully no one will want to take a nap during this, and just keep engaged in the chat with us. And we will, after each of the presenters presents, we will open up for questions after each of those sections, and then at the end as well. The Region 9 staff will be, team will be presenting this. I'll start off, and then Jennifer, Mika, and Elma will present the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so this is an overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to give you some historical background. We're really going back. We want to give you an entire vision and framework around TANF. So we're going to talk a little bit about the historical background, the context, and the purposes. We'll then go to the TANF key requirements, both the program and the fiscal requirements. We'll talk about the TANF work requirements, what's required in TANF plans, those elements, the general TANF program and reporting requirements, and then we're going to talk a little bit about resources and partners. Next slide, please. So we'll start with an organizational overview. I know there are a lot of new folks in all of our jurisdictions, so we'll give you a little snapshot of what our organization looks like and how we're configured. Next slide, please. How we're organized. So Office of Family Assistance is a division under the Administration for Children and Families, which is under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Office of Family Assistance has a central office. You'll hear us refer to that as CO or headquarters. And then under our headquarters office, we have 10 regional offices. Next slide, please. The Office of Family Assistance has multiple divisions, okay? We've got an Office of the Director, and that director, we have a new director. Her name is Ann Flagg. Many of you met her yesterday. Each Office of Family Assistance division reports to the director and the deputy director. Right now, we do not have a deputy director. Our deputy director retired last month, very happily. We miss her very much, but I'm sure we will have a new deputy director in the very near future. So the divisions under the Office of the Director include the Division of State Tanf Policy, and you will meet Julie Siegel later on. She is the director of that division. She and her team are the ones who answer your most complex policy questions. They do a lot more than that, but they are our policy wonks. They are our historical knowledge keepers and contextualizers. They're fantastic at what they do. We have a division of discretionary grants, and that division oversees our Healthy Marriage, Responsible Fatherhood grants. And when we had health opportunity grants, those were also under the division of discretionary grants. We've got the Division of Training and Technical Assistance, which is the foundation of meetings like this and the foundation of many of our technical assistance activities, our national meetings. They partner with OPRE for studies, so they do a lot to support us in getting out, developing technical assistance and getting out technical assistance. We've got the Division of Data Collection and Analysis. They're responsible for all of our data, primarily WPR data. We've got the Division of Tribal TANF Management and Regional Operations, and that division oversees Tribal TANF. Under the Division of Tribal TANF Management and Regional Operations, you've got the Office of Family Assistance regional offices. And the regional offices are the offices that interface with all of you. We serve as the first line in responding to questions, providing technical assistance, answering policy questions, and guiding you with any questions, challenges, service provision issues you have in the administration of your programs. We all work together to administer these federal grant programs that foster family economic security and stability. Next slide, please. This is a map of the regional offices. As you can see, we've got 10. Region 9 covers Arizona, California, Hawaii, Nevada, American Samoa, Micronesia, Guam, Marshall Islands, Republic of Palau, and the Northern Mariana Islands, in addition to 24 tribes. 24 tribal TANF programs and 9 Native Employment Works programs. Region 10 covers Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, in addition to 23 tribal TANF programs, and I'm not sure how many Native Employment Works, but it's multiple. And then as you can see, the rest of our regions cover the rest of the United States. Regions 1 through 3 do not have tribal programs. Regions 4 through 10 do. Next slide, please. So we'll talk to you a little bit about Office of Family Assistance block grants. We have 3 types of block grants. We've got state TANF block grants, and we have programs in 50 states, DC, and in 3 territories, including Guam, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. We also oversee tribal TANF, and we currently have 75 tribal TANF programs. And we also administer Native Employment Works programs, block grant programs. We've currently got 78 Native Employment Works grantees. This tells you a little bit about each of those grant programs. And the Native Employment Works program is on the smaller scale, but it acts for many tribes as kind of a great ancillary program to tribal TANF. Next slide, please. So your regional team, again, your regional team serves as the frontline response to a state grantee and to tribal grantees. We provide technical assistance and guidance to help you improve your program administration, compliance, and your outcomes. We're available to engage in ongoing conversations and to support you to ensure that your programs align with federal requirements, with your plans, and are moving forward well. Next slide, please. To give you a little bit of historical background, context, and purposes, again, Some folks have been around a long time and know what this history is, and others of you are new. So we wanted to include this. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 purposes of TANF. These are the pillars around which TANF is built and should be administered. Hopefully you're all well familiar with these 4 purposes. They should drive all aspects of your program. They are to provide assistance to needy families so children can be cared for in their own homes or the homes of relatives, and the dependence of needy parents on government benefits by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage, prevent and reduce the incidence. I know this is dated language, but reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies and establish annual numerical goals for preventing and reducing the incidence of these types of pregnancies, and encourage the formation and maintenance of 2-parent families. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of legislative history for those of you who are not familiar with it. Prior to 1996, welfare was, and again, that is a dated term, but it was administered under a program called AFDC from 1935 to 1996. In 1996, the Welfare Reform Act was passed. We call it PRORA, which is the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, that replaced the federal state match, AFDC match, with state maintenance of effort requirements under TANF. It created a block grant, and that block grant was the amount of that block grant for each state was based on the 1994 AFDC caseload numbers. And so we established grants for each state based on those numbers. And the idea was that under TANF, which is the new iteration, right, of the program, that over time, because the program would be successful in helping families to become self-sufficient, that your caseload would decrease, but your grant would remain static. So you'd have, over a period of time, over a continuum, you'd have more money to devote to support services and things that really helped families achieve self-sufficiency. Under PRORA, we established new work requirements for grantees. We also established a 5-year time limit for receipt of assistance. PRORA also authorized federally recognized tribes to operate their own TANF programs, and it permitted spending on assistance authorized under prior law within limitations. And we'll talk a little bit about authorized under prior law in a later slide. The next piece of legislation, reauthorization of TANF, happened in 2005. That was called the Deficit Reduction Act. And it did a couple of things. It recalibrated the base year for caseload reduction credit, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. It added families in separate state programs to the work calculation for the work participation rate. It directed HHS to define TANF's statutory work activities. So you'll see in a later slide that we talk about the 12 work activities. And that happened under the Deficit Reduction Act. We became more prescribed about what those could be. We also defined what a work eligible individual is under the Deficit Reduction Act. And an additional element is it required states to develop a work verification plan. The next piece of legislation that reauthorized TANF in 2009 was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We call it ARA because in federal government, we really like our acronyms. This established the TANF Emergency Contingency Fund, and that provided funds to jurisdictions to increase spending on basic assistance, non-recurrent short-term benefits, and subsidized employment. It lifted the restriction that unspent federal TANF funds reserved or carried over from previous fiscal years, it allowed you to carry those over into succeeding fiscal years, and lifted the restriction that those could only be spent on assistance. You can expend those in a more flexible way now under that provision under ARA. Next slide, please. Okay, so that covers the legislation. We have not had another reauthorizing piece of legislation for a long time. I know folks are really eager for that to happen, and I think we are as well. But there have been multiple proposals, but that hasn't come forward yet. So we're going to talk a little bit about state TANF guidance. as I spoke about before, PERORA is the establishing law for TANF. That law was codified under Title IV of the Social Security Act and 42 U.S. Code. So under the Social Security Act, which is not always updated in a timely manner, you will find that PERORA was codified, and so you've got all of the law, the statute that governs TANF there. Under 42 U.S. Code, which is a parallel to the Social Security Act, you will find a more robust and thorough outline of that statute. It's, I think, 601 through 614. And the U.S. Code, if you look up something in the Social Security Act and you can't find it, we recommend that you go to the U.S. Code. It can be found on Westlaw, and most of your attorneys probably have access to that, because all of the portions of the statute that have been repealed, revised, or annotated are outlined at 42 USC. Okay, so the Social Security Act and 42 US Code are the statute, and then we've got the regulations, 45 CFR regulations, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. We want to emphasize not to forget the preamble. There's a lot of really great information in the preamble. And so we encourage you to, when you have a moment, to go back, if you have not familiarized yourself with the preamble, to go back and take a look at that. In the 45 CFR regulations, there are some old AFDC regulations that don't necessarily apply. And this has come up with some of our jurisdictions. They've asked, why don't you repeal those? And the reason we don't repeal them is because Medicaid, other programs such as Medicaid, sometimes use those AFDC rules still. So we can't necessarily repeal them. Also, sometimes old regs apply in reference to a current requirement. So they don't necessarily apply directly, but they're in reference to a current requirement that does apply. So, for example, we had a recent Q&A on 206.10, which does not apply to TANF. So if you have a question about a regulation and whether or not it still currently applies, please reach out to us for that clarification. We are happy to provide that clarification. In addition to the statute and the regulation, we've got policy guidance, which includes information memorandums, and these are used to convey to broadcast information that we would like jurisdictions to be aware of, program instructions, which are used to clarify regulation, policy announcements, which announce new policy. We also have questions and answers. Next slide, please. So this lays out more broadly the TANF laws and regulations. You've got the statute, which is Title IV of the Social Security Act, Part A, and then the TANF regulations, which are 45 CFR Parts 260 through 265. Part 260 is the General Temporary Assistance for Needy Families provisions. Part 261 it covers ensuring that recipients work. 262 is accountability provisions. Part 263, expenditures of state and federal TANF funds. Part 264 is other accountability provisions. Part 265 is data collection and reporting requirements. And then we have a separate set of fiscal regulations known as Part 75, or the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for HHS awards. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about OFA policy guidance. We issue guidance documents to clarify TANF law and regulation. So these include program instructions, which again clarify regulations. We issue information memorandums, which are usually to highlight specific parts of the regulation or requirements around a specific issue. Policy announcements, which are usually new policies, and then questions and answers. So many of you submit policy questions to us and we will answer those. Current guidance on TANF, including frequently asked questions and answers, are available on our website via a link on our website, and we can provide that to you all if that would be helpful. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a slide talking about allowable uses of TANF. And as you can see, all of the allowable uses cascade down from the 4 purposes of TANF. So again, these are the pillars of TANF. They should inform every aspect of your service provision, your expenditures, and what you're doing with your program. So allowable uses and expenditures support needy families and other eligible families through assistance and services that support these 4 purposes. And this shows which are tied to which purpose. Later slides discuss in more detail what supports and activities make up assistance and which activities make up purpose 3 and 4 activities and services. Please note that rules regarding who may receive assistance under TANF are more narrow than the rules for purpose 3 and 4 activities and services. And many provisions, including federal time limits, work participation rates, and data collection requirements only apply to families who are receiving assistance, cash assistance. Next slide, please. Did you know that a jurisdiction does not have to set the same eligibility requirements across TANF-funded activities? Each activity can have its own eligibility standards. For example, a grantee's program may include programs that offer or activities that offer cash assistance, childcare, refundable tax credits, and non-recurrent short-term benefits. Each of these activities can set a different eligibility standard. Next slide, please. All right, authorized solely under prior law. This is a little complicated. I don't know that I even understand it completely. Under Section 404A2 of the Social Security Act, states, thank you, Corey. We can't provide a link to the PowerPoint, but we can get you a copy of the PowerPoint in the future once we have it vetted. So, thank you. Apologies. So under Section 404A2 of the Act, states may use federal TANF funds only for the specific activities that have been previously authorized based on an approved Title 4A or 4F plan in effect as of either 9/30/95 or 8/21/96 per the state option. So what this is really saying is if you had something in your AFDC plan or your jobs program plan, in that period of time, if you were approved to do it under those plans, then you can do it now, only to an equal or a lesser degree than you were doing it then. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with AFDC, there were 2 parts to a 4A plan under AFDC. There was the AFDC plan and there was an emergency assistance plan. And then there was a third piece, which was a Title 4F plan, which is jobs program. That was another piece under AFDC, so it was all broken out. So in order for authorized solely under prior law expenditures to be allowable, these services have to have been in your AFDC plan and they have to be in your current TANF plan. The state may establish a more narrow requirement, service, or benefit in its TANF plan than what was in its AFDC plan, but a state cannot expand that requirement, service, or benefit. So again, if you're approved to do it under your 4A or 4F plan, you can do it now, but only to an equal or lesser degree. So for example, if the state provided a benefit for 6 months in its AFDC plan, it can shorten it to 3 months under its TANF plan, but it cannot increase it to more than 6 months. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Next slide, please. Did you know that individuals with a drug-related felony, that any requirements around that are established by a state, basically. So if the state legislation enacts a specific law that eliminates the prohibition on individuals with drug-related felony from receiving TANF assistance, then the state may use federal TANF funds for assistance for this population, assuming that the individual meets all of your other criteria. If the ban remains, the state may use TANF funds to provide services that are outside of the definition of assistance, sometimes called non-assistance, to individuals with a drug-related felony. The ban does not apply if assistance is provided with MOE through a separate state program, although it does apply to MOE using segregated state funds. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions before we move on to the next sections. I know I moved through that pretty quickly, but hopefully you were able to take some notes and highlight the areas that you have questions about. Oh, and Julie Siegel clarified, thank you, Julie, US code actually goes up to section 619. So it's 42 USC 601 through 619.
And Julie, this is Patrick. I'm not seeing any questions yet, so you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Patrick is monitoring the chat. Feel free to come off microphone as well.
We do have
Julia.
JR who would be interested. Yeah, who has a comment, I think.
Thank you. I was just wondering, it's kind of a broad question, but how come so much of TANF, like half of those 4 pillars, are about like getting married and like preventing children out of wedlock? I've never understood what that has to do with eliminating poverty.
That's a really good question. I think we'd have to ask Congress what they were thinking when they developed that pillar. But I think the idea was that single mothers just had a more challenging time with supporting with raising a child and also making a living. I think that again, it's dated, and I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. That's really something that we grapple with. Language we definitely grapple with. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think again the intent was to prevent creating situations that are challenging for mothers, and they were previously. They're still challenging today for single parents, but they were previously very, very challenging prior to many of the equal rights laws that were passed. Where women lived under pretty tight restrictions. Couldn't have a credit card. I think that changed only in 1970, maybe 1972.
Hey, Julie.
So, yeah,
it's Julie.
Hi.
I'm just going to go out on a limb and kind of. This might not be right, but don't forget this was 1996, and there was a lot of talk back then about evidence or thinking that married 2-parent families were the most stable setting for children. So I suspect that a lot of it came out of that, but I don't know for sure. But that's my guess. And in any case, as Julie Fong said, this is what we got to work with. So that's what we do.
Thank you very much.
Add to what Julie said. Prior to that time, the non-marital birth rate was rising pretty rapidly. There were many births to teen mothers. There was a concern that, if young mothers got on welfare at a young age, they might stay there. There was a big concern about long-term dependency back then. And there certainly was a portion of the caseload that did stay on for a long period, though most of the caseload, came in and off fairly quickly. But that was a big, big topic. They were also concerned about mothers on assistance having additional births. So many of you are familiar with the family cap policy, which denies assistance to a family that has an additional birth while on assistance. And the states started testing those with waivers under AFDC, and many continued into TANF, although now I think there's growing recognition that the policy is not that effective, and it does impoverish families even more.
Thank you so much, Peter and Julie. This is why we have national experts and why we have policy experts. Why we have historical experts, because they hold all of this fantastic knowledge. So thank you, JR, for your question. I know you're new to TANF, and we are more than happy to respond to help you get the big picture. I would like, if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to pass the mic to Mika. I think, or Jennifer. I think Jennifer.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm cutting in line. Hello, my name is Jennifer Seneschal. I'm a program specialist with Region 9, and I'm going to kick off the section that we are referring to as TANF Key Requirements, Program and Fiscal. During this section, we're going to go fairly quickly. A lot of the regulations we're going to speak about, you can go very deep on, but we really, again, as Julie mentioned earlier, want to draw your attention to some of the key components, some of the key requirements, so that you're grounded in those. And again, please keep your questions. You can put them in the chat box or save them in parking lot, because we're going to have some more time later again with Peter and Julie as well. So I will start. The section I'm going to be covering is around TANF funding. So next slide, please. The TANF state funding is made up of what we would call 3 different buckets of funding sources. The one that we've been talking about so far is the TANF block grant. Within the block grant, which was established under PROWARA, the TANF block grant provided the states funds, which are fixed annually at $16.57 or $16.57 billion annually. The TANF amount available for each state was set based on its spending under the pre-1996 AFDC Emergency Assistance, or EA, and Jobs Opportunity and Basic Skills Trainings, or JOBS, training program, using a formula based on peak expenditures during FY 1992 to 1995. Each state grant is known as a state family assistance grant. So this is the block grant and the funding that was established for that. As part of PROWARA, states were also required to do what is called a maintenance of effort, which is expenditures related to TANF or TANF-related activities. The maintenance of effort, or MOE, represents a percentage of the state's FY 1994 contributions to AFDC, emergency assistance, jobs, and AFDC-related childcare. Under this MOE requirement, states must expend in MOE 80% of the amount spent in 1994 expenditures in its former AFDC-related programs. This percentage decreases to 75% if the state meets its work participation requirement for that fiscal year. In addition, there's what's called TANF contingency funds. The 1996 Welfare Reform Law established $2 billion TANF contingency fund due to concerns that TANF funding might be inadequate during economic turndowns. To draw upon contingency funds, a state must meet a test of economic need, meet a 100% contingency fund MOE requirement, and match at the Medicaid rate above this threshold. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. Of note, knowing that we have some folks here that represent territories, contingency funds are available to the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Tribes and territories are ineligible to receive the contingency funds. Next slide, please. So did you know in 2021, the national poverty rate was 14.4%. However, on average, less than 0.6% of people and less than 0.3% of families in the United States were on TANF in FY 2021. This is less than 2 million people and less than 1 million families in a country of about 332 million people. Of note, also, the $16.57 billion figure has not been increased since lawmakers first created TANF. Thus, the value of the block grant has not kept up with inflation. So something to consider. Next slide, please. One of the elements around TANF funds is that states may transfer up to a total of 30% of their current TANF block grants to one of 2 other programs, the first being the Child Care and Development Fund, which provides financial assistance to low-income families to access child care, and no more than 10% to the Social Service Block Grant to provide flexible funding source for states to tailor social service programming to their population needs. So in total, that's a 30% total. And again, only 10% can go to the social service block grant. There are a few things that folks should remember or be aware of when they're considering transferring funds. Funds transferred from TANF to SSBG are to be used only for the programs or services to children and their families whose income is less than 200% of the income poverty guideline applicable to a family of the size involved. The rules, in addition, the rules of the receiving program, so again, if you've transferred your funds to CCDF or SSBG, apply once the funds are transferred. Only current block grant funds from the FY or current grant fiscal year funds may be transferred. You cannot transfer over reserve or carryover funds. So again, there is the capacity to transfer funds up to 30%. Next slide, please. I am going to share now a little bit about MOE, try to define this a little bit better for you. One thing that you'll notice is that we have several hyperlinks here on the page, which are not available right now. So I'm going to try to draw your attention to a few of these things as I speak. So again, this might be a section you want to keep some notes on. As we shared earlier, the TANF block grant includes a maintenance of effort requirements for states and territories. The MOE requirement does not apply to tribes. So that's a difference between states, territories, and tribes. The maintenance of effort, or MOE, for every fiscal year, a state must spend a certain minimum amount of its own money to help families in ways consistent with the TANF program. Any expenditure that was previously authorized and allowable under AFDC and meets one of the purposes of TANF can be included as MOE. All expenditures made must be made on behalf of income-eligible families, with the exceptions of services that meet the definition of pro-family maintenance of effort spending provision. So this is something that if you would like to know a little bit more about, specifics about the pro-family expenditure can be found at TANF ACF PI 2008-10. So again, you can get more information about the pro-family expenditure provision. A couple of things of note and something to keep in mind. MOE services must be included in the TANF plan. So if there's going to be MOE expenditures, it would need to be represented in the TANF plan. And there are two annual reports for MOE expenditures. The 196R, which is a financial report, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later, and the ACF 204. For those of you that are interested in understanding more about MOE, the instructions for both of those reports can be found on the OFA website and are also helpful in understanding MOE and provide additional guidance around these elements. There are two categories or types of state MOE expenditures. These expenditures can come under what is called the state TANF MOE, or it can come under a separate state program. Something to keep in mind, though, is if you are spending money in MOE under the separate state program, it does not count towards the contingency fund. So you want to be aware of those two different buckets of MOE funds. There's a wealth of information around MOE definitions and considerations. So I would refer you to Part 45 or 45 CFR Part 263 for the regulatory guidance on MOE. And then you can go to the OFA website and see PIs and QAs, or I would highly encourage you to reach out to your program specialist if you have specific targeted questions around MOE. The other item that may be of interest is that if you would like to know more about the specific levels of expenditures that are required for each jurisdiction, there is a PI on the OFA website. It is TANF ACF PI 1997-09 that goes into further specifics about the levels of expenditures that are required under MOE. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned before, in the last slide, we talked about the buckets of MOE funding. And these are often referred to under state-funded programs, but there's also a third category of state-funded programs. So we wanted to take a minute to talk to you about these and explain the differences. Something to consider as you're thinking about your program and where you're budgeting and where the funding comes from. Of these three state-funded programs, only two can be counted towards your MOE. And the first is referred to as your state program maintenance of effort, which falls under TANF. The second is what is referred to as separate state program maintenance of effort, or SSP MOE. These are programs that do not come under the TANF program. And the third bucket is what's referred to as solely state funded, or SFF, which are not TANF programs and do not count towards the MOE requirement. So a couple of things that might be helpful to know about these three buckets of funding. I'm just going to go through a few of these. So again, just to reiterate, your state program maintenance of effort are expenditures that fall under the TANF program. These expenditures meet the MOE requirement. Under this program, services that are reported under this area must be reported for caseloads, work participation, and financial data for cases that are funded. It includes state funds that are commingled with federal funds and segregated state funds under the state TANF program. If these funds are segregated from federal funds, some federal rules do not apply. For example, eligible families can include those who would be eligible for TANF but are disqualified by the five-year time limit on federally funded benefits, or families who are disqualified by immigrant restrictions in the 1996 federal welfare law. So that is your state program maintenance of effort, MOE program. The second program, which is your separate state program maintenance of effort, or SSP MOE, these are programs that do not necessarily fall under the state TANF program, and that families receiving assistance through SSPs are not subject to the federal five-year time limit, requirements to assign child care support payments to the state, and various other federal rules. And it's more flexible than your state MOE bucket of funds. States must still report caseload, work participation, and financial data for cases funded with SSP dollars, but important to note that these funds do not count towards the MOE requirement for contingency funds. So those are your two buckets of MOE funds. The third program is what is referred to as solely state funded, or an SSF program. And this is not a TANF program. These funds do not count towards the MOE requirement. They're not subject to federal work requirements or federal requirements or reporting requirements. And states often establish these programs to focus on individuals who do not count towards the state's work participation rate. And for those, the state intends to continue to serve outside of the program. So those are the state funded programs, three different buckets of funds. Again, the first two, the state program maintenance of effort, and then the separate state program maintenance of efforts are both MOE funds. Okay, next slide, please. The TANF law allows states to expend unobligated balances of their block grant funds without time limit. This allows flexibility in the timing of use of federal TANF funds and allows states to set aside funds for unexpected occurrences which might increase costs or demands for basic assistance, such as natural disasters, public health emergencies, or recessions. States may spend carryover funds on any allowable TANF activity, but cannot use them to transfer funds to CCDF or SSBG, as I mentioned earlier. In recent years, states' unobligated balances increased due to decrease in TANF recipients and other factors. And as of at the end of FY 2020, the collective states had a total of $5.2 billion in unobligated balances. Something that states should keep in mind if they do have unobligated balances, that these are the funds that should always be spent first. And that concludes the section on TANF funding. And so I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions.
Nothing coming in, Jennifer. I think you're good to go.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. I am going to hand the mic to Mika.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mika Smith, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about TANF requirements related to work participation, sanctions, and the time limit. I first want to give a little shout out along the lines of what Julie and Jennifer said, just a shout out to Babs yesterday, indicating how it's really helpful to know what the specific requirements are so that then you can see that greater flexibility. And I definitely want to highlight that for my section because it's not everyone's favorite section. So we can go ahead and go to the first slide, please. Or the next slide. Awesome. Okay. So based on statute, there's a certain structure for work participation requirements. And the first piece of that is that there's an overall work participation rate of 50%. And for the 2-parent house caseload, it's 90%. And then we take off the caseload reduction credit, does shift that. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. In addition to the percentage requirement of the rate, there's required work activities and hours, and then there's also the definition of a work eligible individual. So while there is this regulatory structure, it's important to understand that states have a great amount of flexibility with the structure because of the caseload reduction credit. Next slide, please. So the caseload reduction credit can reduce a state's work participation rate targets. If a state's average monthly number of families receiving assistance is less than those who received assistance in fiscal year 2005, the state could receive a reduction. States can also receive a larger caseload reduction credit by spending in excess of their basic MOE requirement. The majority of states, including most on this call, receive a significant reduction from the required work participation rate as stated in statute. States and territories must complete a caseload reduction credit report annually. That's the ACF 202. And that is Elma's going to cover that in the next section, but that's a key resource if you have questions on the caseload reduction credit and the process. Okay, next slide. As part of the overall work requirement, states must engage TANF families with a work eligible individual in one or more of 12 specified work activities. The core and non-core work activities listed here form the composition of the statutory work activities. Next slide. Oh, is my volume low? Thanks, Babs. Okay, I'll see. Is this better? Can you hear me better now? Maybe I'll just speak up more.
There
Maybe
you
it's
go.
my mic. Thank you. Thanks so much for highlighting that. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay, so the work participation requirements include specific hours for work activities that vary by family type, as you can see in this chart here. So we have the overall rate, and that's broken out into single parent families with a child under 6 and other families. And then the 2-parent rate is based on whether childcare is being received. The hourly requirements are divided by core and non-core for all but the single parent with a child under the age of 6 group, which only has the core hours requirement. Next slide. Based in statute, recipients with few exceptions must work as soon as they're job ready or face possible sanction or termination of benefits. States have the autonomy to decide what form of sanctions will take. Sanctions may be individual or full family, partial or full reduction in cash benefits, and temporary or permanent. About a dozen states use a percentage reduction approach for the initial sanction for non-compliance with work requirements. The other common approaches are removing an adult's needs, which is the AFDC sanction policy, and terminating the entire benefit. It's important to note that even if a family or individual has good cause and is not sanctioned, the family or individual remains in the work rate calculation. And then I also want to cover appeals in this piece. And so there is the statutory requirement for states to provide opportunities for recipients who have been adversely affected to be heard in a state administrative or appeals process. Next slide. So did you know that unlike any other safety net program, TANF gives states flexibility to establish eligibility policies and requirements? Almost half the states have adopted a full family sanction as the initial sanction for non-compliance with work requirements. However, there is no empirical support for the effectiveness of stringent sanctioning policies, and many have been found to push families deeper into poverty. Next slide. So we've discussed individual and family sanctions, and now we want to shift to potential state penalties for not meeting certain federal requirements. The most common penalties are listed here. the misuse of funds intentionally or unintentionally, failing to submit required reports, failing to meet the work participation rate. So those are a few of them, and then there is another there is another fuller list, but those are some of the common penalties. As I'm sure you're aware, states do have multiple options for addressing a penalty, and two of the main ones are claiming reasonable cause and providing a corrective action plan to address the issue. Thank you, James. I'll speak up a little bit more. This is normally not my issue, so this is a new thing today. normally I'm a little too loud. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears to another requirement that falls under TANF, which is time limits. So under PERORA, it set a federal time limit of 60 months for families that includes an adult recipient receiving federally funded assistance. States can exceed the 60-month limit for up to 20% of their caseload based on hardship. And it is important to note that, I think that's going to come up in the next slide. Okay, so federal law does not impose a time limit on child-only families or families receiving assistance funded entirely with state MOE funds. And there's also a regulatory exception if a family does not include a head of household or spouse of a head of household, or when a family lives in Indian country or a Native Alaskan village where there is at least 50% of the adults who are not employed. Next slide.
Mika, we had a question come up. Do you want to wait until the end of your step?
Let's see. So Kat says the 2-parent work participation requirement 50-55. Does federally funded childcare include other funding other than federal TANF? I'm going to see if somebody else is I am not sure. I'm not sure that I'm clear. Let's hold it actually, and I'll just finish. I think there's just 2 more, and so I'll finish, and then we'll see if somebody can address that, Kat. But thank you so much for the question, and please keep the questions coming in, and we'll get to them. Yes. Okay. Next, let's see. I think yes. So we're on the time limit. So did you know that almost half of states have adopted a time limit shorter than 60 months? The 60-month federal time limit applies to the average monthly caseload. So states who may choose to fund cases in a segregated state program or separate state program, they may choose to do that if the cases are nearing a 60-month time limit, or if if the cases are nearing a 60-month time limit and the state is beyond the 20% cases under hardship. But it's very helpful to note that most states are nowhere near reaching that 20% hardship exemption. So that could be something to consider as you're thinking about that time limit and what the needs are for your families. Okay, at this point, next we're gonna be shifting to the TANF plans. And so before we do that, I did want to go back to Kat's question, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna call on my colleagues to see if anyone is familiar, has a sense for that question.
This is Peter. I think the answer is that it would include CCDF. I would want to, of course, confer with Julie, the expert, but on the data collection, we do ask whether people receive subsidized childcare and if it's entirely funded or in part with federal funds. And as examples, we give TANF, CCDF, SSBG, or other federally funded childcare. So I'm pretty sure that it would apply to that. I doubt that there are many families, though, in that situation. I mean, there aren't that many 2-parent families left on the rolls.
Good point. This is Julie Siegel, and I agree with Peter. I can't think of the question having come up before, but the law seems pretty clear. It just says federally funded. It doesn't say, with TANF funds. So I feel pretty confident the answer is yes, it would apply.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks, Peter. Any other questions on this this section at this point in time? Are looking at the work participation rate, sanctions, time limit. And if you have them, please hold on to them. We're going to have more time for questions in a bit too. Okay, I think we'll move on to the Tanf Plan. We have a few slides to talk to you about the required Tanf plans. Next slide. So each state develops its own state Tanf plan, which describes how it will support the 4 purposes of Tanf and ensure program compliance. The state Tanf plan needs to clearly present how the state utilizes the Tanf block grant, as well as any of the funding that you spend for state with your state MOE dollars. There are required plan elements listed here. And a couple of them are very straightforward. Like the first one that really falls connected in with the Tanf purposes. So provides assistance to needy families following the statute. So how the state is going to do that, ensuring that parents and caretakers receiving assistance are engaged in a work activity. And then there are ones that are maybe more very pointed and were put out in regulation. And so it is just really important to highlight a very specific provisions, such as describing how the state provides education and training on the problem of statutory rape so that teen pregnancy prevention programs may be expanded in scope to include men. So very specific, and oftentimes that requires really putting together meeting together with multiple partners to ensure that you have the information of what's occurring within your jurisdiction for related to that regulation. Okay, next slide. Did you know that we have a new state Tanf certification requirement? This just popped up this year. Hopefully you do know. Hopefully you got our messages. We do have this PI came out in February, and we just want to draw your attention to it, that it's from the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. And it adds a new Tanf certification related to providing information to victims of sexual harassment or survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And this does need to be implemented by March of next year. So if you have questions, please check out the PI. It's from it's PI 2022-02. And you can also reach out to your program specialist if you have questions with regard to this PI. Next slide, please. The last slide that I'm going to touch on as far as plans is related to the work verification plan. So in 2005, the Deficit Reduction Act required that each state submit and maintain a work verification plan. Work verification plans lay out a state's Tanf work program, including countable work activities, how the state will monitor and verify participation in work activities, how the state will comply with time limits on certain activities, and how the state will determine who is work eligible. There are 3 main resources for requirements and submission of related to the work participation, the work verification plan. So there is a guide that came out in 2008, and then we have 2 more recent program instructions. And it is important to reference all 3 documents because there have been some updates and additions related to that initial guide. And then also please reach out to your program specialist. We can be a great support to you if you're needing to make an amendment with your work verification plan. And that's what I've got. If you have any questions, please come off mute or send something into the chat.
Mika, I wanted to add one thing if I could.
Yes, please.
About the federally funded childcare. I noted that there aren't that many 2-parent families. One of the things you need to check is to see how you fund 2-parent families. About or close to half the states have placed them in a solely state-funded program where none of these rules apply. So if your state doesn't have a 2-parent family in the Tanf program, it still might be serving them exactly as it otherwise would, but it's in a funding stream where the rules don't apply. So you need to double check, how your state funds the program.
Great point, Peter. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to pass it off to Alma to talk to us about reporting.
Sorry, I was going to jump in.
Oh, yes, please do.
Sorry, this is Babs. And I'm just wondering, in context with everything that we've said here, or you're talking about here today, I'm just wondering, Julie, if you know of what ACF might be doing in relation to research around the potentially disproportionate impact of some of the TANF policies and procedures. Is there any research work being done by like OPRE or anyone else to take a look at that?
I'm not sure which Julie you were talking to.
That's exactly what I was gonna.
Julie Fung, please.
Either one of you or Peter or Micah or Jenny.
Well, I think in the past, OPRE has had some reports on, for example, how states apply time limits or sanctions. But I think the point you raised is extremely important. It's something that we haven't looked at in enough detail. And it's something where, at least in OFA, we're beginning to think about ideas to look at, some of the issues. For example, the take-up rate of benefits among eligible families has plummeted from 80% in 96 to 21% today. One thing we could look at is in the SNAP caseload, who has income low enough to be on TANF but isn't getting it, and why? Is it the sanction policies? Is it, unreasonable work requirement hours? Is it something else? So we're going to be looking at that. And obviously, if you guys have ideas, we would love to hear them.
Oh, I have tons and tons of ideas. And I think what you just talked about, Peter, in terms of the really low rate of take up since the inception of the program is probably in relation to a number of things. Definitely the onerous requirements. I'm using onerous because I'm a state, not a federal. I don't have to be impartial.
I say they're onerous too, so it's okay.
Exactly. The onerous requirements. I also think that we're far enough down the road, 25 plus years of TANF, that we have seen people time limit off. And so they are receiving SNAP, but not able to receive TANF anymore. So I think that's a particular issue. And I think, frankly, from my perspective, we should be looking at why TANF failed those families. If they weren't able to make the jump within 5 years, why are we failing them? And I think, frankly, the other piece I'm looking at is, do the policies we have assume, and I think they do, so I'm going in this direction, do the policies we have around TANF assume that everybody's starting from the same place and it takes the same time? And I would tell you that we have data in Washington that indicates that's not correct, and that 5 years is not enough for some populations, and that we should be looking at the disproportionate negative impact these programs and policies potentially have on certain populations.
Yeah, if I can, I'd like to echo what you said. I mean, if you read the book $2 a day, in many states, TANF has been so diminished, people aren't even aware of the program existing, or there may be, to use your words, onerous application requirements that cause families to leave. If you're a single mom and you don't have any preschool kids, TANF expects you to participate 130 hours a month. And in some states, you're only getting $200, $300, $400. So we effectively force people to value their time at $2, $3, $4 an hour. I mean, that's probably one reason why the take-up rate is so low.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say the other reason around take-up rates is, Washington's probably middle of the road in terms of benefit level, cash benefit level. And the fact is that we have a high minimum wage. Or higher than some states' minimum wage. And you can work less than 20 hours, I think it is, or right around 20 hours a week and be income ineligible for TANF.
Those are really good points, Babs. I'll just underscore what Peter said. Send ideas. We work with OPRE and others who carry out research, and we'd be happy to try to talk about some of these questions with them and see if we can get some evidence to shed some light in these areas.
Thanks for letting me stand on a soapbox for a while, guys. Thanks.
Your comments are well informed and well taken, Babs. Any other questions before we pass the mic? Or comments or observations? All right, let's pass the mic. I think Elma's up next.
Yes, I am. I have the lucky task of sharing all the general TANF program and reporting requirements. And so we'll go through this as quickly as we can. But I do want to just remind folks that much of this information is available on the website. And there's a lot of great instructions on it. So I know I spend a lot of time there, so I'm sure you will find it very useful as well. Okay, next slide. So let's start with EVES, what we know as EVES. And EVES is the Income and Eligibility Verification System. And it was established to conduct data matches some time ago as part of the verification process for not only TANF, but also for SNAP and the Medicaid programs. So we know that there's the states often uses to match TANF application and recipient information for like internal IRS data on interest, dividends, and other types of unearned income. As well as looking for matches under the Social Security Administration data for retirement, survivor, and any of those kind of SSI benefits that they may see. So keep in mind that some states have expanded their own EVES requirement and include DOJ, Paris, and other types of systems, to name a few. So this is a requirement. Anybody who is applying for any type of benefits is required to have this EVES verification. So next slide, please. So this is what I was referring to just a moment ago. The EVES requirement under section 11 or 1137 of the Act does apply to any applicant who is receiving benefits under TANF, where income or citizenship and alienage is part of the eligibility requirement. So we do have to use EVES, sadly, but we do have to use EVES. Okay, next slide. Another report that is that we use quite often in the work that we do as program specialists, as well as our fiscal folks, is we look at the 196R. We know that each state must file a quarterly expenditure report on the state's use of federal TANF funds, as well as state TANF expenditures and state expenditures of MOE funds. And you'll see that, you know, that this illustration just shows you all the different quarters and when these reports are due. All of these reports must be submitted in OLDC, and a state must submit quarterly reports for each open grant year, whether or not it had any expenditures during the quarter. And I know that can be cumbersome, but it is required if you have some funds that are carried over from previous years. Keep in mind that all of these reports are due 45 days after the end of each quarter. Next slide. The TANF annual report, what we call oftentimes the 204, ACF 204 report, must be submitted at the end of the year. Now, they're due by November the 14th, but there's no penalty if you submit them by December the 31st. Also want to tell you that that this report often works in conjunction with the 196R. They work in concert with one another. There's a balance. There's a reconciliation between what's reported on the 196R and the 204. We look at both of these reports when we're reviewing the 204, just so you're familiar with our process. And we may have questions that relate to any of these reports when we're doing that review. So each state must file an annual report containing information on the TANF program and the state's MOE program for that year, Part A. And each state must also provide information on the state's programs for which the state claims MOE expenditures. And the next bullet is a really important one too, not only to the 196, 196R and the 204, we also look at the state plan. And we're looking at that state plan to make sure that everything that you're reporting in the ACF 204, the MOE expenditures are reflected in the state plan. So keep that in mind as well. So all of those reports work in concert with one another. And we do take a look at that when we're reviewing all these reports. All these reports must be submitted via OLTC. Next slide. Okay, this is the caseload reduction credits, what we were talking about earlier. States can receive a credit for reducing their caseload between the base year 205 and the comparison year. States must submit these reports for a caseload reduction credit by completing the ACF 202, which is due December 31st. States may further reduce their caseloads through the expenditure of MOE in excess of the required spending level. So just keep in mind, all these reports seem like there is a mad rush to get a lot of these things done at the end of the year, but keep these in mind. And again, the ACF website will have a lot of information on specific maybe Q&As that you may have regarding the caseload reduction credit, any questions on the computation, how this is computed, all of that is referenced in the OFA website. Next slide, please. Another report that's also due is, or it's due quarterly, is the ACF 199 Tanf data report and the ACF 209, the SSP MOE data report. These report includes hours of participation for work eligible individuals, and it reports on 4 separate sections. And you'll see that the quarters are similar to those that that are for the 196R. They're all the same basic quarters, all due at the same time as well. But there's a lot of information on the ACF 199 as well. I find that to be a very interesting report. Okay, next slide. The annual, we refer to it annually because it's due annually, but it's the A133 audit. That report is conducted annually by our Office of Audit Services. What's very different here to note is not only do we use the CFR Part 75, we also use the 2 CFR Part 200. And you'll, every now and then when something does come up, you'll see the reference to both of those regulations. Oftentimes, these annual audits will test for eligibility, allowable activities, and allowable costs. The auditor does review your internal controls, questions costs, fraud, and prior findings, and you probably can all tell us what you've experienced on these annual audits as well. So every now and then sanctions may be imposed, but they're not done so in isolation. States are given the opportunity to correct audit findings before any sanctions are imposed. So keep that in mind. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the fun part of this presentation. We get to share some resources and some partners that you may find to be very, very helpful as you look at what other programs are doing and maybe what some of the data shows. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the first one we want to really focus on is the OFA Peer Technical Assistance Network. Peer TA, as we refer to it often, facilitates the sharing of information across state and local agencies that implement TANF programs. We found that to be really, really helpful because it really gives you, when you're thinking about providing a specific service in a particular area, you might see some evidence of other programs that have done it and what experience did they have and how did they form that program. So you might find it to be really, really helpful. The goal of Peer TA is to establish linkages among TANF agencies and their partners that serve TANF and low-income families at the state, county, local, and tribal level. So you want to keep in mind that the website is a repository for all OFA TA activities. It includes training and technical assistance. It includes a resource library and has peer connections and is a learning center. So please find the time to, if you don't already, visit this website frequently because there's a lot of great information on it. Next slide. this is I've heard of this as well. I have not gone on it myself. One of the great successes in this particular website is the Coaching for Success online learning modules. I've heard it's great. I've heard a lot of positive feedback from a lot of grantees who have participated, or her staff has participated on this learning module. So please take a look at it, see if it might be of interest to you. So keep in mind that this is something that is very, very useful, and strongly recommend that you visit this site frequently. Next slide. We were just talking about OPRE, which is the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. We know that, we need to have much more of this, and this is what Julie and Peter just discussed. That there's so much to study, so much to learn. TANF has been around for a while. We all know what's working or what's not working. At least, and the research will help support maybe potential changes and potential changes in how we do things. So take a look at OPRE. It's a division of the Administration of Children and Families. It really completes thorough, rigorous research and evaluation of projects. These include evaluations of existing programs and evaluations of innovative approaches to helping low-income children and families. It just is so much information. And one of the things I have found to be really, really interesting is the pathways of work evidence clearinghouse. That is really, really useful. It's pretty comprehensive. You can put in a lot of, you can put in some specific information with regards to work evidence and things that have been tried in different areas. So I strongly encourage you to do that. I've gone on that particular website quite a bit and have found it to be very, very useful. Next slide. So we have other government partners. We also work closely with the Office of Grants Management. They directly administer and manage and provide financial stewardship and technical guidance to more than 60 ACF programs and regional office for discretionary mandatory grants and cooperative agreements. They are just extremely helpful. We work closely together oftentimes on issues that cross from program to fiscal. And so they're a very, very strong partner in the work that we do every day. The Congressional Research Service has several useful reports on various aspects of TANF, such as legislative history and proposed TANF reauthorization bills. So you might find that to be really, really helpful as well. And of course, another almost mandatory tool that we have to have is our regulations, right? And they're now electronic, and it just makes it so much better to access. And again, this is something that we strongly recommend that you review frequently as things come up. And I think that concludes my presentation. Is there any questions?
This is Peter. I may have missed this, but did you guys highlight on our website where we have information? For example, the ACF 199 is reflected in our characteristics report. It's also reflected in our tables on work participation. Was there a slide that sort of talked about all the ways we use the data and publish it?
There is not on this particular deck of slides. And that's why I refer back to the OFA website, because I find that the website to be much more, has a lot of information on each reporting requirement. So we do not have anything on this slide, but that's why we refer back to the website, because that's really where the in-depth knowledge is and all the instructions are with regard to the ACF 199.
That's a great piece to highlight though, Peter. Thanks for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
All awake. Have we put you to sleep? Thank you so much, Elma, Mika, Jennifer. You did a fantastic job in presenting all of that information. Thank you so much, Peter and Julie S., for your support and for popping in to help answer questions. And we'd like to open it up for a Q&A. I don't have a clock in front of me. Does someone else, is it?
It's 2:29.
You're right on time.
Yeah.
Sounds like they're saving up tough questions for Julie Siegel.
We can go into we had made space to be able to go into brief breakouts if we wanted to do that just for these 10 minutes before, and then we'll be taking a break between this session and the next session that we get to share with Julie Siegel and Peter. So we could jump into that, or we could do a larger discussion Q&A.
I think let's jump into the breakout groups. Unless, again, I'm just going to put out there one more time because we have 1 minute. Any other questions or anything folks want to pop in to discuss in the larger group before we go out into breakout groups? So some things to, before we pop into breakout groups, you'll be randomly placed in breakout groups like you were yesterday. You might automatically just go into that room, or you'll receive an invite and you just click join to enter. But some things to think about in your breakout groups are what are the 1 to 2 biggest aha moments this presentation has brought to you, and how might you be able to use the information you learned today back at your program? How might you take it back and decide what you need to maybe dig deeper into, or you need clarification, how you might share it with your colleagues. For those of you who are new, how you might use it as a foundation for learning more. So how might you be able to use this information and apply it and share it with folks back at your program and in the implementation of your program? So I think we will go ahead and ask our tech folks to go ahead and pop us into our breakout rooms. And when we come back, we're going to have a break and then go into our fireside chat with Julie and Peter. Thank you. Thank you so much for participating in the Tanf Essentials. And we are now going to segue into a fireside chat with our fantastic in-house Tanf experts. I'd like to introduce to you Peter Germanis. He is our national expert on Tanf in the Office of the Director and the Office of Family Assistance. Prior to coming to ACF, Peter worked on welfare reform and poverty-related issues at the Heritage Foundation, the White House, and the American Enterprise Institute. His current work focuses on Tanf policy issues, particularly work requirements and evidence-based policymaking. And next is Julie Siegel. Julie is the Director of the Division of State Tanf Policy in the Office of Family Assistance. Prior to becoming Division Director, Julie served as a program specialist in the division, primarily focusing on policy relating to work activities, work participation rates, and caseload reduction credits. Before the creation of TANF with the 1996 passage of PRORA, Julie worked for OFA on policy in the Job Opportunities and Basic Skills Training Program. Julie served as a legislative assistant to 2 members in the U.S. House of Representatives prior to joining HHS. Now, this session, before we start, is aimed to be a 2-way dialogue. So we hope that you will put your cameras on and engage with Julie and Peter in a dialogue, dropping your questions in the chat or just coming off mute and asking. We'll give you a few minutes now to come onto camera and to get ready to engage with Julie and Peter. All your most pressing, complex TANF questions, get ready to ask. These are the folks to ask them of.
So Julie, if I might, it seems like at this time of year, it might be more appropriate to have a poolside chat than a fireside chat. But But I also wanted to say that, you introduced the Tanf Essentials section saying that it wasn't going to be very exciting. And I can't understand why you would say that. And you also, but it may be because, you're wearing a different hat from me. Here's my hat. Here's my policy wonk hat. So I just thought I should, we should get that straight right away. Where Peter and I are always happy to, I call it the Peter and Julie show, and we're happy to, try to answer this, or what did we call it? Stump a Fed one time, Peter?
Yes. Yes.
And we can be stumped, and we can always huddle back with our colleagues to get your questions answered as needed. And we'll try not to go down too many rabbit holes and keep it where it applies to everybody. And Peter, you'll want to
hear you, Peter.
off. Yeah.
I was going to add, if you all thought Julie Fong's jokes were funny, we're in for a real treat. Julie Siegel is hilarious, but also a policy expert. So go ahead and give us your questions.
We work well together. Our humor works well together, Peter.
So I've got a question in the chat right now. If a program plans to spend the full PEEF allotment, but there may be an issue with getting all the funds expended by September 30th, 2022, which is the deadline, can they still spend them before the reporting date in December? Would that be okay?
And shall I answer this one, Peter?
Please.
That's a big no. September 30, 2022 is the deadline. You must obligate, liquidate, get the money out by then. There's no opportunity to get additional funds, and those funds will go away. So, I understand there are lots of difficulties in how, in fact, I don't understand at all how it works when states spend money, but I know that it's complicated, and I get that. But you have to spend the money, you have to obligate, and you have to liquidate by that date. And it would make us very happy if you would begin to draw down your funds. That would, people are nervous right now about PEEF. So please do.
And I believe if you don't draw them all down, you're ineligible when the unused funding is reallotted to the other states. So if states leave $100 million, that's going to be reallocated. But if you didn't spend your money the first time around, you won't be getting a second round.
Thank you, Peter and Julie. Christine said, Guam spent all our PEEF, so if any state still has leftover, we'll be more than happy to take it. All right.
And now I have to look, because there are states that spent all their money and tell us they spent all their money, but they didn't actually draw it down. In Guam, the last report I had shows you drew down all but a small $5,402.67. Okay, so you know about it, you're good, right? Yeah. Excellent.
Another question in the chat. Will HHS continue to exercise reasonable cause to the maximum extent possible for WPR failures in fiscal year 2021?
Okay, so I'll take this one. This is talking about COVID-19. And the short answer is yes. If COVID-19 is the reason that you failed and you can make that case, you can draw a connection, do it. And there's no reason that we would treat 2021 differently from what we did in 2022 once we get the 2021 rates out.
I would also
in 2020, different than 2020.
2020.
Right?
Did I say 2022? 2020. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the one thing I would also add is we don't expect a lot of failures in 2021. In 2020, there were no states that failed the overall work rate. because most had a very large caseload reduction credit. In fact, 30 states went into the year with a 0% target, meaning they didn't have to serve anybody. They'd already satisfied the requirement. Caseloads didn't really rise that much in 2020, and even in 2021, they kept coming down. So we expect a lot of states will still have pretty significant caseload reduction credits when we do the 2021 rates and when we do the 2022 rates.
That's a really good point, Peter. And I think it also goes back to what Babs was saying about understanding the rules, helping you know what the flexibility is. In this case, when you have 30, how many was it? 30
states.
30 states that have a zero target because their credit is higher than the 50% rate. That doesn't mean that you're not working with families or that, it doesn't mean anything negative. What it means is you now have an incredible amount of flexibility. You've already met the federal requirements. So you get to engage families within whatever rules you have in your state in the best ways possible, whether it's something that would be countable or not. It frees you up. So
I would add also, though, even though we haven't published the 2021 rates, they did come down quite a bit from 2020, in part because COVID only affected half the year in 2020. But so many states have much lower work participation rates, but you have to look at what your target is as well. Many states cleared it by a mile in 2020 and will be fine in 2021.
Thank you both for that. Come on, folks. We've got our two experts here ready to take your questions.
I'm really interested in kind of what we started to talk about in the breakout, but for everybody, what kinds of stuff did you hear in the TANF Essentials? I mean, that was a lot of information being thrown at you. And so what kinds of stuff was like, wait a minute, what was that? That kind of thing. And no shame. I mean, I have to go back to my cheat sheet documents, and I wrote a lot of this about the regulations. So, things like that it's confusing or some, anything at all that came from that, that you think you just want to ask. Go for it.
I wrote down a note that said unobligated balances should always be spent first with many exclamation points, but I still don't understand what that is.
Okay, so do you understand what an unobligated balance is?
No.
Okay, so you get your TANF grant for the year, right? The state does, you don't, but, and then the state spends a certain amount of it. Let's just say, let's say it was $1 million, just to be, Peter will fix these things, and the state spends 800,000, right? Now there's 200,000 left that you didn't spend. When it goes into the next year, we sometimes call it carryover funds, or there's rainy day funds. That is your unobligated balance, the money you didn't spend. And it may be money you didn't spend from 20 and 19 and 2018. And maybe so the 5.2 billion that I think they mentioned that all the states have, that can be from a few years. So the idea is use up the old money first so that we can close out grant years. It used to be that you could only spend that carryover money on assistance as it's defined in the law. But the Recovery Act changed that and said you can spend it on any TANF allowable activity. So it does drive the grants people a little crazy that there isn't a life cycle that you have 2 years to spend it or whatever it is. It's kind of forever. Or at least right now it is. Who knows if that would ever change. But so that's why they say, please use up the old money first. That's all. Peter, anything you want to add?
Well, you report how you spend on the ACF 196R, which was covered in the slide deck. And when you fill in the numbers, you fill in the spending from each open grant award, whether it's 2020, 2021, 2019. So we keep track of your spending, federal spending, year by year. And as soon as you've depleted all of one grant award, then we can close it and move on. Now, I would note that unobligated balance only applies to federal block grant funds. It doesn't apply to MOE or the contingency fund.
That's right. Yeah, MOE is the money you spent in a given fiscal year. There isn't anything to carry over. It's like reporting what did you spend that year from your own state monies.
And again, if you have questions, you should never hesitate to ask, the regional folks to explain, how things work, because TANF is one of the more complicated programs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I worked on Capitol Hill, I had a friend in another office, and we used to have what we called the stupid question of the month club. And so I could ask her something that I didn't feel like I could ask other people, and she did the same with me. And then I discovered, as fun as that was, it's really just better. The only stupid question is the one that you don't ask. So go for it.
I would also
Agreed.
note, when Julie first came to work at OFA, I used to walk by and quiz her about jobs in AFDC. She loved it.
It was very stressful. But it's true. He did. He would come up and I'm like, oh my God, I'm supposed to know this thing. And that's when I decided, no, I don't know it. I'm going to ask him, what do you mean? And we've done very well that way. So.
Peter's done really well
another
that way.
question in,
Oh, sorry.
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to
Go
add
ahead,
in
Mika.
that Peter's done really well that way with all of us at OFA of like creating quizzes, but then he also provides the answer too after a little bit. So that's been very, very helpful, educating everyone, continuing that education process. So we're all in that same boat. And really quick before, just to put a little plug for anybody on the line before we go to the question in the chat. I know something that definitely came up in our breakout group was a lot of interest in MOE. It is so complex and there's a lot of interest in understanding it more. And so if you don't have a particular question right now, it just sounded like there's a lot of interest in learning more in general. But please do feel free if you have a question, even general as it is, feel free to bring up one of those. General's good.
We are more likely to be able to answer those. Yeah.
As well as the ones related, there's interest, more interest in the caseload reduction credit too, which can be a little bit more specific.
It's simple. Yeah.
But we can do our best. So feel free to bring those up.
So there is a question in the chat. We can either pivot to that or talk about MOE and then pivot to the question in the chat, or talk about the question in the chat and then go to MOE. What's your preference?
Well, what's the question about MOE? I mean, we could talk about MOE, but.
Yeah, Mika, give us a sense of what sorts of things people wanted to hear about MOE, which I will also say there are just a few people who say Mo. So if you say Mo, we won't laugh at you.
I think the sense that I got is there's just a general interest in learning a lot more, which was great to hear. And I think maybe there's a way in which we could even do a deeper dive into that. And that was one of the points of this TANF State Essentials, was to see like where are the areas where we can go deeper.
You're saying Momo?
That's right.
Momo,
That's right.
yes, Momo.
But please feel free to jump in. Oh, a deep dive. Yeah, we got a vote from Miguel on that. So, but if anybody wants to put it in the chat. I think at this point, if we don't have I didn't have a particular question or specific question that came in, but just a lot of interest is definitely what was bubbling.
I don't know what sorts of things, but I guess I would say I'll start something and Peter can elaborate and say something much more erudite. There are some different rules that apply to federal funds and state funds, or MOE. And you guys talked about that in the presentation. There's a lot that's very similar, but there are a few things that are different. There are some places in the law that talk about a program funded under this part or something like that, which really refers to TANF. So that in that case, it would be federal funds or state TANF that you spend on, that you call part of your TANF program. And there are other places that specifically talk about federal funds, like the time limit that you were talking about. So if your fiscal folks segregate the state dollars and say nothing gets mixed together, then you could fund families with MOE without regard to the federal time limit. So that's one kind of thing. Peter, stop me rambling.
Okay, what I'm going to do, I hope this is okay, but I'm going to recommend a document that the Center for Law and Social Policy produced. It's called Use of Funds, Guide to the Use of Funds, and it's about TANF. You can Google it, it'll come up. And on page 12, they have a list of things that apply to each of these funding streams. You might find the whole document helpful, but for example, the first item listed is others can receive if authorized under prior law. We talked about that during the slide session. That only applies to federal funds. It doesn't apply to segregated states, commingled, or separate state program funds. The income eligibility and verification system requirements apply to federal funds, commingled funds, segregated state funds, but not to separate state program funds. I don't know why when they designed the program, they had to decide that you have to look at 5 different funding streams, assistance, non-assistance, how the funds are used. They all have different rules. It's extremely complicated. But this is a good resource if you sort of just want, some basics.
Peter, if you can grab the URL and put it in the chat, that would be really handy. I think JR.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to try.
And if you can't, then email it to me and I'll put it in.
Oh, okay.
Or just give me.
There, Patrick got it. Patrick
There
got
we
it.
go. Thank you.
So the one that you got to, JR, that's our website, and that's our frequently asked questions. Yes, that stuff should apply. I guess my only caveat is this document is from a different organization. CLASP is a great group, and they do a lot of good stuff. I don't think that we particularly vetted that document, but it's probably 100% right. But just throwing that out as disclaimer. Don't rely on that. If there's something that's really, you're really unsure about, ask us so that we can give you a formal answer.
So I do have unless you guys want to continue to talk about MOE, I do have one question. Okay, so the one question in the chat, is there any discussion about TANF reauthorization and what might it include?
So I'm just going to start because Peter could spend the rest of the day talking about this. And I'm going to let him, he knows a lot more about various things that have been proposed at different points. I would say that it's really kind of speculative on our part, and we can talk about, what we've seen, what are common types of things, but there isn't an administration proposal, and so this is just us kind of talking. Peter.
Yeah, Julie always has to warn everyone that what I say is not official position necessarily, but thank you, Julie. I think somebody mentioned in the slides, there were a couple of mentions of reauthorizations like the 2005 Deficit Reduction Act, ARA. I don't know if these are called reauthorizations, but TANF is almost always running out of funding. If you count those as reauthorizations, it's been reauthorized over 50 times because they'll always give us money for like a year and then it expires. They'll extend it for 3 months or whatever. But in any event, there's been some discussion about welfare reform. There are a couple of bills in Congress, and there are a couple of areas where there's some bipartisan agreement. For example, some of the bills would establish an income limit on the receipt of all TANF benefits of 200% of poverty. Some would phase out the ability of states to count non-governmental spending as MOE. I don't think we got into that in the slides, but states count a food bank spending as their own. That's something that there's a lot of agreement in Congress about both parties that it should be phased out. I think the biggest thing, though, is there's a lot of concern that many states, especially in regions 1 through 8, have taken the TANF funding and diverted it to fill budget holes.
Especially in regions 1 through 8. I love that. Very good.
So
know your audience. Yeah.
Yes. If you look at the TANF spending charts, basic assistance is only a little over 20%. Work activities are less than 10%. There's childcare, but in some states, TANF goes to child welfare, to pre-K, to all sorts of refundable credits, to services for after school kids, things like that. And so there's concern. I mean, some people call TANF a candy store or a slush fund. So there is some concern that that money is being diverted from basic assistance to these activities. And so the main approach that I've seen, at least in legislation, to deal with that is to put a spending floor requirement. That is, a state has to spend at least 25-30% of its TANF MOE funds on certain key core activities like basic assistance, work activities. Most of the floors are generally pretty low, so they wouldn't affect necessarily a lot of states. But, in some states, the amount spent on basic assistance is, well below 10%. So the goal is to get some states, again, regions 1 to 8, to spend a little bit more on those core activities. Now, there are also, and this is where there's less bipartisan support, some people still think TANF is an unprecedented success and that the key is the work requirements. Other people think the work requirement is a seriously flawed accountability measure. So anytime someone tries to talk about work requirements, it's highly controversial and very little gets done. But there are a lot of ways you could change it. You could focus on outcomes as opposed to a process measure like the work rate, but there are issues with that if someone wants to ask a question. Some proposals would increase the amount of the block grant. The problem with that is, unless there's some guidelines like spending floors, the money may simply go to fund non-welfare activities, which may be fine, but TANF's supposed to be welfare reform, not a form of revenue sharing. And then some people would want to toughen the work requirements, for example, by, the caseload reduction credit looks at the decline since 2005. They want to recalibrate it again so that, you look at like 2018 or 2020, and the decline from that point, which means the work requirements would get much tougher. Anyway, I'm not optimistic that anything anytime soon would be passed that's meaningful. I think the most significant change was when we almost had the expanded child tax credit that fills in a lot of the holes by TANF. That there was talk about making that permanent, or at least for a few years, but that doesn't seem to. Well, that's not in play right now. And while that's not a TANF reform, one of the proposals would have gotten rid of TANF. So in effect, it would have replaced it.
Thanks, Peter. That was really good. I hope that we get a chance to discuss these ideas and look at ways that TANF could be made better. And it's not because we don't want to see spending on child welfare or childcare. It's that we think cash assistance is important and that it is really an upstream benefit that can avoid some other problems. But so I see we have
There's another question.
Yeah, please.
In
Julie.
the chat, is there a specific or consolidated table that shows the amount of cash assistance given to families by household size for each state or jurisdiction?
And I think the best place to go to for that information is probably the welfare rules database. Would you agree, Peter?
Yeah, you were asking about the benefit by family size, not the amount of spending by family size, right?
Cash assistance, right.
Yeah. So anything, if you want to know about the rules different states have, whether it's the amount of the benefit level, the earnings disregard, asset limits, the welfare rules database, I don't know if someone can plug that into the chat.
Go, Patrick.
Has the rules for every single year from 1996 through 2020. So that's an incredibly useful and detailed resource.
And it's relatively easy to do a query. And I think there are some basic ones that are kind of laid out there already. But that's a project that the Urban Institute runs for us or with us or on our behalf, because as you know, from the data that you report, there's a lot of stuff that we don't collect. We have more general information, but they've been able to do it. There's the link. Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, they also show changes from like 1996 to 2020. So you can see that maybe, I think it's something like 16 states haven't increased their benefit levels since 1996, and some have even reduced them. So you can get fun facts like that.
And I wanted to, that reminds me of something I wanted to say earlier during the TANF Essentials presentation, which you guys did a fabulous job, by the way, all of you. I can't remember who it was. If it was Jennifer, was talking about how the block grant hasn't changed since 1996. It's the same amount of money based on this very complicated formula that Congress agreed to then. And I've learned from my economist friend Peter that so that means that it's lost 40% of its buying power, that it might as well have had a 40% reduction if you want to keep, the dollars that we knew in 1996. So that's a significant amount of, that's a very, very large amount of drop. For those who don't really, I was surprised when I realized that it was 40% change in that amount of time.
The other thing, though, to keep in mind is even though TANF is a $30 billion program when you count MOE, only $7 billion or even less is spent on cash assistance. But that sort of reflects the demise of the cash assistance safety net, at least. I mean, as I mentioned before, it used to be that the take-up rate was of 80% among eligible families. And the main reason the caseload has declined so much and the spending on assistance has declined so much is not because that many families left welfare for work. It's because so many fewer eligible families are getting assistance. So if we do increase spending, it's important to structure it in a way to make sure it goes to basic assistance.
And if all of this is too crazy and confusing and doesn't make sense, then just bring us back to where you are and what you want to know, and something that works in your state and you're not sure if it's a state problem or a federal problem or why it's there. Feel free to just go in a completely different direction.
On that point, just since you made the take-up rate point, this is something that California brought up yesterday in their presentation of really doing kind of some pointed outreach, having a CalWORKs outreach plan and looking to increase. Right now, they have estimated that they're only reaching 60% of those who could be eligible. And so it'd be interesting. I don't know if that's something else that other states have looked into on this call, but I thought that was really interesting that they brought that up and just relates directly with what you mentioned.
And I think California is like the nation's leader in sort of enrolling eligible families. I think one of the problems is TANF is seen in many states as a form of revenue sharing. It's funding all sorts of activities. So it's hard, like the TANF agency can't just get all of this money back for TANF purposes. It requires legislation in the state as well.
Peter, say what you mean by revenue sharing.
It means it's a pot of money that can be used for a wide range of activities. And in fact, a lot of times TANF can be used to build, for example, it could be used to build highways, not technically, but you could take a federal TANF dollar and supplant something the state was spending that would count, let's say for now, some form of child welfare. Well, that frees up the state's general revenues, and they could use it. In fact, some states have used it for tax cuts for wealthier families. They could use it for other things. So I don't know if that's the best explanation, but it's.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of times people don't know what that means, but yeah, it just means that we're flexible enough that legislators or governors or, people above our pay grade decide that there's some other way there are constraints on state budgets, and, being such a flexible program is a double-edged sword, I guess. So, and we want to see it help and you do too, the poorest people who need the programs that you're trying to run. So, there's work to be done at all levels.
The one sad thing about TANF, though, is the states do have unprecedented flexibility also within cash assistance to do full family sanctions, shorter time limits than the 5-year time limit. There's no other federal program that's like that. SNAP, for example, has fairly uniform rules across states. People are entitled to get it. That's not the case in TANF. And TANF serves the poorest. You would think the program for the poorest would at least have some basic safeguards, but not since 1996.
Thank you, Peter and Julie. So we've got about 5 minutes left of our poolside chat. And the chat box is open. Feel free to jump in. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Come on, a tough one.
Come on, guys. You got 4 minutes now.
Not you, Mika. No.
So Brooke in Nevada said this is really helpful insight. Thank you.
I think that's where we were talking about the dwindling effect of the block grant.
Yes.
The one sad thing is TANF has a lot of problems. It's exciting for us to be working on it because there's so much we could be doing and thinking about. I mean, as someone who's interested in policy, it is exciting to work on TANF. The problem is there's so much misinformation about TANF, and the key to getting any kind of change, involves educating policymakers and the public. And too often Congress will enact things that, given TANF's flexibilities, are so easily circumvented, as in the Deficit Reduction Act. But it's still considered a model to reform all the other safety net programs by some people.
So, Peter, why do you think that a substantive reauthorization momentum hasn't taken place? I mean, especially in the context of what's happened over the last several years and where we're going with the economy now, I would think that there would be some sort of momentum behind a substantive reauthorization and consideration of how this program could help the poorest of the poor become economically.
The problem is the group that thinks TANF was a success will object to anything that would involve, let's say, a change to the work requirements. In fact, I think it's in 2018, the Ways and Means Committee, the subcommittee that deals with TANF, passed out the Jobs for Success Act. And it basically replaced the work rate with an outcomes approach. But then other conservatives like Robert Rector at the Heritage Foundation said, oh, no, you're gutting the work requirement. And so even within the same party, there was a lot of debate, and then it got changed. And it's just politics and the inability of people to look at TANF objectively. I can't figure it out.
I think that's right, that TANF represents some tiny fraction of a % of the federal budget. Peter maybe knows what that fraction is, but
it's less than 1%.
Yeah. Yes. Thus, yes. Anyway, so a fraction of a %. and yet people care about it. They think that it gets so terribly political. I think there are some people who think this is people getting something for nothing. And there are others who it just becomes toxic. So there is a tiny little window in the political timeline, in the election cycle, where they can even begin to think about reauthorization. At least that's how it seems to me. When it gets too close to an election, and too close seems to be but longer and longer period of time, nobody wants to touch it. And it's a shame, because there really is more agreement on at least some things. And then I think the other thing is that once you open something up, what else might happen, right? They can't just pass the things that they agree on. And that happened in 96. I mean, I don't think a lot of people didn't think it was going to pass when Prewara came along, and then it got vetoed twice, and the immigration provisions were a big obstacle, and then suddenly it happened. So it could happen again, but I do think it just gets disproportionately political.
There has been some change at least in the Republican Party. Some people acknowledge, for example, that TANF is broken. Rand Paul had put TANF in his Festivus report. Abuses like the kind of abuse in Mississippi, highlight some of the problems. So I don't know, we may be getting there slowly, but it's that whole debate about work requirements that seems to sink it every time.
So Brooke had a nice comment in the chat there about more discussion on how we can really invest in TANF families to ensure we are spending as many TANF dollars on eligible services, benefits, and programs as possible. And yeah, I mean, feel free to come off mute and talk about that, but that's our goal too. We definitely want to help you do that within the bounds of the federal rules and requirements that we have.
So being relatively new to TANF as a whole, I just got promoted to the program specialist position for MOE specifically. So having these types of discussions and having that background and in just that information, even though it's a wealth of information, and yes, it can be overwhelming, it's really offered insight into ways that we can look into ensuring that we're spending as much as possible in our TANF program for, those TANF eligible services and programs, and developing those when we're looking at subawards and grants and things like that. So this has been extremely helpful. So I appreciate both of you giving your insight on that.
Excellent.
Well, I think talking to your neighbors also, like, I think California always does a good job and is very detailed. So, within the regions, you guys can collaborate and share information.
Well, and that's really why I think forums, in this type of context where we can collaborate with other agencies and states in our region is beneficial. So whether it's a small state or a larger state, and just having an idea of how their programs operate and what they're doing can give us ideas as well for our own programs. But just having some of that background information, obviously we want to do everything that we can to keep those TANF dollars going towards TANF families, not necessarily being diverted in other areas. So yeah, that's extremely helpful. At least it was for me.
Thank you, Brooke. And I don't want to stop the conversation, but we are at time. So just quickly, any other burning questions or comments, thoughts?
And I would just say, stay in touch with Julie and her team and Frank and his team. And, if there's something that you need our help with, Peter and I are happy to jump on calls with with our regional colleagues and you guys and figure out what's going on and try to find a way forward.
Thank you so much, Peter and Julie. We appreciate your time very, very much. And your hat. Love your hat. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to my colleague, Patrick, to close us out for today.
Hey, folks. So if you thought yesterday's closing comments were sweet and short, prepare for closing comments that are even sweeter and shorter today. So big shout out. Thank you to my Region 9 colleagues and Central Office colleagues for their great presentations today. Thanks to everyone who came on, asked great questions, and participated in great conversation. We will start up again tomorrow at 1. I think same bat time, same bat channel kind of thing. And I'm trying to think of anything else. Let's go ahead and have that survey pop up if we can. So before you jump off, if you could complete the survey, that would be fantastic. Should be appearing any second now. There we are. Not even an awkward pause needed. There it was. So again, thanks everybody. Much appreciated.